Right. Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our 2026 Agnes Lewis Memorial Lecture. My name is Andreas Bieler. I'm the Vice President of the UCU branch here at the University of Nottingham. It's my pleasure to chair this talk and to introduce our speaker. So welcome to our audience online, and of course, a welcome to our audience in the room, and to our speaker, Howard Stevenson. So why do we have this lecture? Yeah, it was in August 2024 that we suddenly had the shock news that our president, well, she wasn't president at the time, she had just stepped down due to national level duties, but our president, Agnes Lewis, had died. And because of her very strong impact on the branch, having led us through so many industrial relations disputes. In order to honor her memory, one of the things we have established is an annual honorary lecture in memory of Agnes Lewis. And it's my particular pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Howard Stevenson, Emeritus Professor of Education here at the University of Nottingham, but perhaps for us, even more importantly, also past president. Yeah, Howard, you had a longer stint from 2013, I think, until at least 2016, 3 years as president. And then, of course, again, there was another stint of half a year more recently as our president. And again, it was a period of industrial dispute. Colleagues, there's rarely a moment at this university that we are not in industrial dispute. Yes, I think if you go back to 2018, at least since then, we have had dozens of strike days and days of industrial action. Now, the title of today's lecture is appropriately called How We Win. And there's no more urgent discussions on that than now, where we are fighting this savage restructuring at our university. So I think the way of how we are going to proceed is, Howard, you will speak first for about, what did you say?
You tell me, Andreas.
No, I mean, we have a chance.
Can I try and do it in about 45 minutes?
45 minutes, I think, will work well. And then we have time for questions, answers, and discussions. Thanks a lot. Are you going to monitor the online chat, or we do that here from the front?
I'm going to go into my phone is currently active as microphone, so I can't.
Okay, so I perhaps can join with my laptop this Zoom call. Perfect. So thanks a lot, everyone. Howard, over to you. I think in order to be seen, you need to come.
Right, I need to stand where you are, Andreas, and I need to stay reasonably still, don't I? Which is not something I'm always very good at doing.
The one thing we have technically is, though, that we don't see the PowerPoint.
You can have it over, just go over to PowerPoint, so I'm talking. Oh, good. Just...
There we are. Howard, over to you.
Right, okay. So this feels slightly peculiar with all that technology, but hello to people online. A big thank you to people who battled through these temperatures today to sort of be here in person. And a big thank you to the branch for the invitation to make this particular presentation. This was a photograph I took of Agnes, and some of you will recognise on the right-hand side is Catherine Rottenberg, who was previous vice president, actually, I think, to Agnes's president. And this was the two of them in action as we were mobilising one of the previous disputes. And I just like the way the photograph sort of captured both of them, as it were, in action. But just to follow up quickly on Andreas's point, it's difficult to understand quite how or why Agnes had so much impact on us, actually, and how we all sort of still feel her loss so much. I mean, it's said because you just can't quite put it into words, but it was substantial, and her loss still affects us all. And to be part of, well, to be able to give this presentation is is a real honour and something I'm very proud to do. I do just want to say, though, I'm not Mick Lynch, obviously. Last year's memorial lecture was Mick Lynch, arguably one of the most effective trade union communicators in several recent years. So following on from that feels just a little bit intimidating. But if I manage the expectations in that way, and you understand that I'm definitely not Mick Lynch, then I'm sure we'll be fine. Right, so you've given me the challenge because I was given this title of How We Win. And obviously at this moment in this institution, that issue is posed very, very stark because you're in a fight of your lives in that sense. You know, I'm now a bit removed from question mark on the end of it, or, you know, can we win? Or I don't know, those sort of uncertainties that we carry with us in the trade union movement, because we haven't always had a great track record of winning. We have been on the back foot for a long time. But I do think we have learned important lessons in the relatively recent past about how we can win. And what I want to do is share some of my thinking around those sorts of issues. Just very briefly about myself as a little bit of background. I started teaching in 1987 as a school teacher. So I came into higher education where I worked in the School of Education and started off as a school teacher, and where I became a member of the National Union of Teachers. And I immediately became what is called a school rep, the union representative in my school. And it was off the back of a big dispute in the mid-1980s that some people might have some knowledge of. And that, you know, people were at a bit of a low ebb. It wasn't a great outcome. But I did walk into a really powerful, strong, well-unionised group in my workplace. And I think I learned a lot from that about the importance of organising in workplaces right next to workers are. And so, you know, I did that work. It ended up actually doing a PhD about the changing role of the union rep. I think it's one or two people who've got FE backgrounds in here, actually. Of course, FE, which has UCU members, had a similar experience of a sort of fragmentation of the system, decentralisation, neoliberal new public management, we would call it. And what I could see was those issues being shunted down to the workplace and the school reps not being particularly well prepared for it. So my research started from my experience of wrestling with that issue, developed into a PhD. That then took me into higher education, and to sort of slightly bookend where that started, the work that I was most proud of as a trade unionist was that school rep role in that branch in a school in Leicestershire. But the work that I was involved in here. And so what I'm going to do is reflect on quite a lot of that experience of this branch. And although there might be, I don't know who's on the call, whether there's people from outside of education backgrounds. So bear with me. It's going to be quite educational as a context. It's certainly going to relate to this branch, but I think the issues have got a wider application. And the two pieces of work that I've done in terms of publications and research more recently are the two that are on the slides. There's a book that I wrote with some others about the turn to organising in the National Education Union. The book's called Lessons in Organising. And then more recently, a piece of work I did with a colleague at the University of Naples, which is a project about union renewal, union building in education unions across Europe. And it's if you know European funding, you know that projects always have funny titles. So it's called Your Turn for some reason. But Your Turn 2 is easily findable on the web, and the report is there, and there's a shortened version of it. And I'm going to draw on some of those ideas. Okay, I'm going to start with a very brief story that I'm going to hopefully return to at the end if I get all this right. I've said that this branch at this moment, if you're not part of it and you're not completely familiar with what's going on, is in the middle of what you might call an intense period of struggle. So there's a marking and assessment boycott. The employers have, as a consequence, withdrawn all pay from all people involved in that boycott. That you're right in the middle of that at this moment. Just a little while ago, on the 22nd of May, the branch had a all-out one-day strike at the sort of start of this campaign. I came along to that just to show some solidarity. And I was walking from the west entrance on the picket line to the protest in the quad of, what's it called, the quadrangle of the Trent building, which is where the protest rally was organised. And I was walking alongside a colleague, and you're talking as you do, and she was explaining how the union had sort of helped her have a voice about what she felt needed to happen in the university to push back against what was going on with the cuts, the closures, the decimation of jobs. And she described how the union was helping her to, as it were, find her own voice in pushing back against that. Right? Nothing particularly dramatic there. But what she said was, which stuck with me, was I don't know why it's taken me so many years to understand that that's the role of, that the union can do that for me. That the union can be that voice and give me, my interpretation of what she was saying was, and can give me that power. She said, I don't know why I didn't understand that previously. And I think there's a sort of two things going on. One is a context, which is what the university is doing, which in a sense, the union didn't have control over. But that other element of that then is, well, what the union does to respond to that. So there's the context and what that response is. And as a consequence of that response, she was describing a shift from being in the union, some interest in the union, but not to the point where she was going on picket lines. And in fact, I think on that day spoke to the television press. Now, to me, that is like quite a transformation. And that social scientist in me is sort of saying, what's going on? Right, because if we can make that happen more widely, we bring about the power, or we build the power that brings about the change. So I'm sort of interested in that person who just randomly said, I'd never understood that the union could be that, could perform that function. Yeah? So that's the sort of backdrop to what I'm going to talk about. I'm definitely going to need a hydration break at time. So in the Your Turn work, we pitched the idea in the best academic traditions of the notion of a theory of change. Right? If you're familiar with the work of Marshall Gantz, he talks about theory of change. He's the sort of social movement strategist. If you're familiar with a book recently published by Jane Holgate, and a partner, it's called Change Agents, they use the notion of a theory of change. And we use it in the report, and I think it's really powerful. You know, what we're recognizing is that if we want how we win, any win must by definition represent a change. Sounds evident. Have we got some sense of an understanding of what makes change happen? Because if we, in a sense, get a better understanding of what drives change, why does change happen? Why does it assume the form that it does? Why does it happen when it does? we can, I think, begin to develop more appropriate responses to the things that are happening around us. And what Jane Holgate and John Page argue is, the employers have a theory of change. They have consultants, dare I say it, they have people in business schools, who tell them what change is and how to manage it. There are whole, departments focused on managing change. As a movement, we need to think more about what our theory of change is. So in that report, and drawing on people like Marshall Gantz, just very briefly, right. So if we want to win, we must, by definition, want change. And change is driven by a purpose. Right? It's important to state, because sometimes when we talk about organising, people disconnect organising from the reason why we want to organise. Right? We don't organise for its own sake. We organise to achieve something. And actually, in my experience, efforts to recruit people into the union that are not really based on trying to win something typically don't go very far. Right? We organise for a purpose. Change is driven by a purpose. The employers have their purposes, right? Because that purpose is linked to interests. And those interests can be either material or ideational. For us, material interests, wages, pensions, working conditions. But ideational interests are about things that we believe in. Social justice, democracy, public ownership, all things that actually are sort of heart of the university. Now, this shouldn't be controversial, but the next bit of it actually sometimes is. Change is driven by interests. Our interests and our employers' interests are not the same. Right? Now, that's probably not very contentious in here, but to a lot of colleagues, they would not see it in those terms. There are other people in the trade union movement who won't see things in these terms. Right? And of course, when the university, questioned by the press about the redundancy notices going out, said, well, we will do what we can to look after our people who we're handing out 2,700 redundancy notices to. But it's a discourse which says we're all on the same side. We don't want to do this, but we are doing it in your interests. And that can be a powerful discourse. But because those interests are not the same, they are by definition contested. If we're trying to push one way and the employer is trying to push another, there is by definition a struggle. And that struggle, that contestation, will depend in some form on the relative balance of power. Because winning is getting the employer to say yes when they want to say no. Right? Getting the employer to say yes when they're happy to say yes is not really a win. A win is getting the employer to say yes when what they believe is in their interest to say no. They will not do that unless the balance of forces tips in such a way that making a concession becomes the obvious thing for them to do. So the balance of power is crucial. We have no option but to build our power. And that power, of course, resides in the workforce, not just in the union, it resides in the workforce. And workers being willing to take action. But what I put here is when we talk about union building, we typically focus on recruitment, right? There is, and I completely understand why, but it's an obsession in a sense about building the numbers. And we underestimate the importance of building the commitment. Because the power resides in people being in the union and willing to take the action that puts the employer under pressure and that makes them say no, makes them say yes when they want to say no. So it's building the commitment that is really sort of crucial. And in a sense, what I was interested in when I had that conversation with that colleague is there is someone who has gone from being in the union, has an interest in the union, but to a point where they're like really participating in it. There's a sort of level of commitment that has been built. And in a sense, that's where, if we want to grow power in the organisation, that is what is required to do. I think anybody engaged in making that happen is exercising leadership. Right? The act of bringing about that change, if we're talking about building to win or how we win, the act of making that happen, building the power to make it possible, requires leadership. Because leadership is actively working with others to build power, to bring about change. So in this report, we argue that leadership is the sort of the active ingredient of building union power. Right? Leadership is what we do. We just have to do more of it. Right? We have to get better at it. We have to develop more people who feel more confident to do the sorts of things that brings these changes about. Yeah. And we turn the air conditioning down so it's really cold. Right. So leadership is the key, the active ingredient, right? So in this report, we present 3 propositions about leadership, right? 3 propositions about this bit of this, which is, this is the bit we need to grow to build the union power in order to get the wins. So 3 propositions about leadership, which we talk about in the report. One is leadership is a practice, not a position, right? It's what people do. It's not the position or the office that they hold, right? And I've been in lots of meetings where people have said, well, we're trying to bring about change in the organisation and the people at the top are stopping us. And my point is, well, they're nominally leaders, but in a sense, what they're not doing is leadership. They're cementing a status quo. But if leadership is a practice, it's what people do, it's not a position, you can have leadership at any level of the organisation. Any level of the organisation, right? Leadership is strategic, educative, and relational. I'll say more about that in a moment. And the most important aspect of leadership is what in the report we call linked leadership, which is the leadership that is closest to the members in their place of work. So leadership is a practice, not a position. You can have it at any level of the organisation. And crucially, you can grow it, you can develop it, you can build it. Well, what are we trying to build? This is our argument that leadership has these 3 different dimensions to it. There is a strategic element, right? It's about values, purposes, connecting purposes and plans. Marshall Gantz is really good on this stuff. If you've not come across his work before, it's Gantz, G-A-N-Z. Lots of stuff on YouTube. But, you know, we do need to get better sometimes as a movement at thinking strategically. And the difficulty of strategic thinking is it forces you actually to have to make some quite difficult choices, because the key to being strategic is it involves prioritizing. And what we tend to do is try to do everything and then burn ourselves out. And being strategic does that, poses that differently. There's an educative dimension of leadership. I I've put here communicating narratives, developing counter consciousness, right? Giving people ways to think differently about how things can be. Right? Because we all know, working in a university, that there's a sort of normalizing of a whole load of things that we should probably never have allowed to be normalized. But the power works by the drip, drip, drip of everyday reinforcement. And to shift people's thinking actually is an educative process. You're encouraging people to think differently about how things can be. And the relational element of leadership is about sort of building connection and building networks. I think it's about building solidarity. But it means I feel like I belong to something. So a transactional union member pays their subs, doesn't do anything else, expects several of the people in this room to do their work on their behalf, because that's what I pay the union subs for. The relational element, I see myself as part of the union. I belong to the union, and when the union acts, I act with it. But you have to build that. That doesn't just happen. You have to build it. So what we're saying is these three elements of leadership, they all need to exist, but collectively in the organisation. It's not that one person has to be able to do all of these things. It's that actually these different elements all need to sort of coexist alongside each other, right? How are we doing? Hang in there. The people online have gone for a cup of tea. Third bit of this, third proposition. The most important leadership is the leadership closest to the members. And we called it linked leadership. So when I was at school rep, as a school teacher 30 plus, nearly 40 years ago, you know, the union rep in the school was the obvious sort of point of contact. When I came into higher education, there were sometimes reps in different departments. But in my experience, people didn't really know what their role was or what they ought to do or whether they needed to do very much. And in those cases, I would argue that linked leadership is actually relatively weak. The challenge is to build that connection between the people who run the branch and most members in their workplace most of the time getting on with their work. The challenge is to make a connection between those two things and make it as strong as possible. And so it is to build this thing called linked leadership. And it looks different in different unions and different contexts. But the principle is, if I look to the union, what do I see? If I literally look to the union, what do I see? Is it seeing the general secretary on the telly, an email in the inbox, or is it the colleague who's in the office down the corridor from me, who I know and I can knock on their door and ask them a question because I know them and I'm bumping into them? What is how close is the union to an ordinary person in an ordinary working environment? So one of the UCU branches I've worked with on a project that I'm involved in is an FE branch, and I'm not singling them out. There's lots of examples of this, but this illustrates it. 4 campuses, all the union activists in the branch are on one campus. So in each of the other 3 branches, you don't really see the union as a thing. It doesn't really exist as a connection. So my view is, inevitably, that is a weak link. But it's not just how close is that, and you know, sometimes it's worth thinking, you know, what should the ratio be? Can't really say this very easily, but what should the ratio be of reps to numbers of members that they represent? Right? In an ideal world. But it's not just about proximity, it's about, well, what does that rep do? Yeah? Because if I see that rep able to go to the management of my school or department and raise particular issues and bring about change, then actually that person is more significant in my working life than if that person doesn't feel they have the confidence to do that and they don't do that sort of work. Yeah. So it's like, how close are they? What are they able to do? And the third element of this, in a sense, is, and here's a bit of Joan McAlevey, you know, if you talk about the organic leader, you know, what's the nature of my connection to that person? Is this person somebody I respect, somebody, you know, who I admire, somebody who, when they represent the union, is able to sort of pull me into that? Because when it's the opposite, that link becomes sort of weaker. So the point is, this is the point of connection. And I don't want to be too crude about this and saying the members and the branch, but anybody who's done this work knows that there are, by and large, people who get the work done most of the time, and there are other people. And rather than that being a sort of two distinct groups, when linked leadership is developed and it is strong, then those things become closely connected. Yeah. So to give it a bit of evidential basis, hang with me on this. How are we doing? Hang with me on this. I'm going to go for it. Right. To provide some evidence to support what I've just been arguing. Right. This was a piece of work that I did with a colleague for what was then the National Union of Teachers. And the National Union of Teachers, as we talked about in this book, had decided or found its way towards sort of trying to become what you might call a more organising union rather than a historically servicing type approach. And it wanted to make some evaluation really about how effective this might have been. So a colleague and I did some work for the NUT, as part of which we undertook a survey. Now, conscious there's some very clever mathematicians in the room, and I am definitely not a mathematician, but my colleague was, and I think I've got a way of explaining what it is that we did, right? But we undertook a survey. It went to about 1,500. The returns came from about 1,500 teachers. There were about 40 odd questions. And what you see here is, I think it's 26 or 27 questions here, statements. And the reason why there's these statements here is because what my colleague was able to do is demonstrate that these statements were statistically related. Right? Let me tell you how. If I answered yes to this question, right, well, before you even get there, question at the top was the question that the least number of people said yes to. Right? So I regularly go to what is effectively my branch meeting, the lowest number of respondents to that question. Right? Remember, National Union of Teachers is often spread over big, geographically wide branches, lots of workplaces. It's actually quite difficult to hold a branch meeting and get a lot of people to it. But, you know, basic democratic unit of the union, and not many people engage with it. The easiest question to say yes for, if the union exists for teachers like me. In the National Union of Teachers, everyone's a teacher, so everyone relates to that state. Right? That union has changed now. That might look different. In UCU, you know, there are different groups of members, and I'm not sure everyone has an equal view about how the union acts on their behalf. You know, you get these inequalities. Anyway, that's not. If I said yes to this question, I keep up to date with union issues, yeah? But I said no to the union has influence on workload management in my school. This is the clever bit. I don't know how she did it, but I do sort of understand the principle of it. I'm very likely to have said yes to everything underneath. And I'm very unlikely to have said yes to anything above it. So I'm saying yes to all the statements below, and then I get to a point and my yeses become no's. Does that make sense? So, in a sense, the higher up the scale I go, the more active and engaged I am. The lower down, the less active and engaged. Yeah? Hang in there. Right. So the interesting question to ask is, well, what determines whether I'm up here or down here? It didn't depend on age. It didn't depend on type of school. It didn't depend on gender. Those things made really small differences. The one factor that made a statistically significant difference was whether in answering that survey, the person responded that there was a union rep in their school, or there wasn't. And these are just distribution curves flipped on their side. So without a rep, you're peaking down here, and it's very, this is big with a word and a mouse thing, it's not illustrative purposes only. But with a rep, the one statistically significant difference with a rep up here. So my point to the NUC executive was the one factor that makes a difference is the fact that you've got some control over. You can recruit more reps. I'm not saying it's easy, but you can recruit more reps. You can grow them. You can develop them. You can encourage them to do more than they currently do. Because this is just rep or no rep, right? Imagine if you've got a really good rep. That effect is going to be amplified, right? So, one of the members of the executive came back when I reported this and said, come on, Prof, tell us something we don't already know. School rep, priority 1, 2, and 3. But in our survey, 46% of their members did not see that person in their workplace. Probably because they didn't exist. There was no rep in the school. Or maybe they existed, but at such a level that people didn't even know they were rep. So the point is, this is what makes the difference. We can do something about this. Sometimes we think we're already doing it, but we're not doing it very well. This is where the capacity in the organization is. People either doing this work or who are near to doing it and who can be drawn into doing it. Am I convincing you? Are you sure? I'm with you. Turn the aircon down. Turn the aircon down. Right. Let's bring this a little bit up to date. Try and finish in 10 minutes. I charted this for an article. It's the ballot results for UCU from the start of the pensions dispute through to actually, I think the last ballot was for 4 fights. That was and what you've got here, for people who are online, maybe not so familiar with this, there's a lot to take in actually, but there were 2 disputes going on. Pensions is the USS dispute. 4 fights was about pay and working conditions. It starts getting very complicated now. I'm trying not to get too complicated, but the pensions dispute was only the older universities. The 4 fights was the whole of the university sector. And as we This started off as a pensions dispute, expanded as we get to November 23. The pensions dispute starts to be resolved, and the final ballot is on forfeits. Yeah. Now, if you go here, the first ballot, national figures, which for people, it's getting a bit obscure, but people at the time might remember, these were disaggregated ballots. So we got very reliable figures for each individual branch. 58% turnout, 88% yes vote. University of Nottingham, 58% turnout, 88% yes vote. Bang on the national figures. But then, as we all know, there was a protracted period of industrial action, mostly strikes. Of course, there were some marking boycotts. Partly, of course, because the mandate has to be renewed every 6 months. A strike mandate goes stale after 6 months, has to be renewed. So we get multiple ballots. Right, just sort of bear with me. I'll jump to the end. But in the final ballot, which is November 23, which by this time is for the forfeits only, right, the national turnout is 43%. Nowhere near 50%, which is what you need for the action to proceed. So by definition, the dispute came to an end. Now, we can't be completely confident in this figure because it's based on our own records of who's voted. But in all the previous experience, those records were pretty accurate. So the University of Nottingham, I mean, their divergence from 2018 to 2023. Imagine if the whole union was working at that level. That dispute would have carried on. It might have looked quite different. I mean, the point is, something has been going on there to explain that divergence. Does that make sense? Does it? Yeah. Now, I think a big part of that is the work that the branch collectively started to do to build that network of workplace reps in departments who historically had sometimes, in a small number of cases, been quite active, but in most cases were probably a name on a list and not very active. And what the branch did was consciously and deliberately and strategically try to build that group of people up in much the way I described earlier. So more reps, which takes the reps closer to members in their workplace, but confident to do more activity. So becoming, as it were, more prominent to their colleagues. And where people were doing this really well, they're holding meetings in their departments, they're connecting. And so that sort of relational element about building the networks of solidarity, not expecting people to come from far-flung parts of the university and its different campuses to a meeting every now and again, but taking the union into schools and departments. Now, when we talk about this, you can tell me different, but I think that was a big part of what actually delivered a very different outcome there. Can I go for about 5 more minutes? It would be embarrassing if you said no, wouldn't it? It would be awkward at that point, and then I'd probably just crumpled on the floor at that point. Anyway, I'm going to jump one or two things, but I think what this branch has demonstrated is what building strong leadership looks like. And it actually makes for a much stronger democracy in the branch, because even when you have brilliantly attended branch meetings, right? But it's still a fraction of the whole membership. But what reps do is take that deep into different parts of the university. Not going to go into this. I'm going to get to here. So obviously that dispute ended. And you can see how it ended, right? In 2023, that final ballot nationally was at 43%, right? Yeah, that's people who've decided they've had enough, broadly speaking. And probably, I'm guessing, in a lot of cases, there was a crash after, because people put so much effort in, worked so hard. But the thing is, if you've got a sort of level of activism at branch level and in workplaces, by which I mean department, school, then not everything depends on the big national set piece dispute, because you're still organising around the things that matter to people in their workplace, some of which might be specific to their particular area of the university. But in 2026, therefore, now, look, I know there's a sort of national picture going on here, but it's very uneven. It happens to be particularly acute at this institution for interesting reasons. But in 2026, 2,700 stuff. I don't need to, look, you're living this. But look at that. I think that is an extraordinary achievement. And I think, this is the second ballot as part of this dispute, isn't it? So what I'm saying is, now Andreas would say, "Oh, but management have made it easy for us, Howard. The situation is so appalling." But I sort of accept that to a point, but only to a point, right? You know, if you were flat on your backsides after that last dispute because hadn't got the outcomes that you wanted and the effort was all washed out, this might have looked very different, but because there's a sort of depth. Hi, Laurie, just coming in 6 out there. Because there is a sort of depth to what the union has accomplished, then when the focus shifts from the national dispute, being largely sort of run from sort of Carlo Street, in a sense, let's say, to something much more local, you can still deliver results like that. Do not underestimate the scale of this achievement, in my view. I think it's extraordinary, right? How can we explain it? I'm really moving towards the end. It's built off that network of workplace reps that I've been talking about. Or not workplace. It's built by the union being rooted in all aspects of the university, where people are doing their work. That's what it's sort of built on, in my view. But ever since COVID, the union hasn't just focused on that sort of, as it were, workplace militancy. But people in this room have done extraordinary work. For example, developing alternatives to the management's way of financing the institution, or managing its finances, or mismanaging its finances. So, for people who don't know, there was a financial strategy in 2021. There's a more recent one. These documents are online, aren't they? And if people aren't aware of them, they really should look at them. They are extraordinary, I think, in the level of detail, the way they've been crafted and put together. But the point is, it's not just about being on a picket line. They give people an alternative way of seeing what is possible. And so my colleague, who I was talking to, as we walked from the picket line over to the university, and she talked about how the union was able to sort of articulate what it is that she was thinking, reflects the fact that the union had given her a way to not just sort of articulate, but also actually see that the change is possible, that things could be different. And it's done it both at a practical level. I mean, these are very detailed documents, combined with a narrative about a different type of university. So in a sense, what's going on is people are seeing what's wrong in their institution and wanting to do something about it. There are practical alternatives, and it's not about the university, the union managing the university, but it is about letting people know things can be different. And there's a whole sort of notion of what a public, democratic, civic university can look like. And I think the success of the branch has been its ability to, as it were, militant organisation at the level of the workplace, but an ability to organise politically at a higher level. And what we're seeing, to get to the C word, is a sort of shift in consciousness. Which isn't what we talk about very much, but if we want to win, this is what we have to do. Right? Gramsci said, we've all got a way of seeing the world. Right? We all make sense of the world in particular ways. Whatever we think about it, we've got a sort of a logic in our mind. Right? Does it feel right? Does it feel wrong? I mean, at the moment, lots of people think it's wrong, but they're not looking to us for solutions. They're looking elsewhere. Can we help people understand why it's wrong as the first step to thinking about how it might be different? Do I believe it can be different? Gramsci talks about moving from a conception of the world to a higher conception. Right? Do I believe change is possible? Because we've all got a theory of change in us. Right? If I think there's nothing I can do about it, my own internal theory of change has said, well, there's nothing you can do about it. Right? What we have to do is give people a theory of change which says, do you know what? If I link my views to others, act together, do something about it, then change becomes possible. And not just my material interests, but stretching it further, I've said, from the picket line to Palestine. But what's happening in Palestine might not very obviously affect my job in Nottingham. But actually, when this develops, I am able to make connections between the struggles I'm involved in and other people's struggles. This is the bit, right? We can't control the context. When the university comes in with Future Nottingham or whatever it is, or the employers came in with the pension cuts, we didn't control those things. You have to sort of respond to them. And to respond to them, we need people to take action. But for people to take action, they first need to think differently before they act differently. And I think what we have to do is help people think differently. We have to actively make that happen. That's an educative process. That is shifting people's thinking. And that is what we do. And the more people who not only do it, but who can develop others to do it, starts to build power, which brings about change. So I'm going to finish on one final point. I think the phrase that best describes this is blowing smoke at my own arse, right? I nearly didn't do it, but I'm going to do it. So Lopa Leach, many of you will know, is the current president of the branch. This is something she wrote some time ago. It's Twitter. It's obviously nonsense. She's not. I haven't changed her life, but in some small way, I think she is sort of saying something that it certainly, gave me a warm glow. But just unpicking it, whilst hugely unhappy with what's happening in HE and what I could do, right? She can see it's wrong. she is not necessarily feeling she can do very much about it. And in various ways, people have helped her sort of make sense of that situation. And her thinking has shifted. So a photograph, it's Chris, isn't it, at the back of the room? But I'm conscious that there's red hot. I'm conscious there's a red hot photographer at the back of the room, and I'm putting my little, picket line snaps up. But I took this photograph, and I liked it, and of course it's Lopa and Agnes in a rally in the middle of Trent Courtyard. And it just sort of captured, the thing. But, in a sense, Lopa has moved from, I can see it's crap, not sure what I can do about it, to this point here, because the union has given her that ability to think I can make change. And this is another photograph I took. Lopa is now the president of the branch. When you're right in the middle of what is the most difficult, sharpest, sort of intense disputes that, I can remember having any sort of connection to, frankly. Agnes, God bless her, but Agnes was not involved in the union when she came to Nottingham. She didn't have a background of union involvement. She had a background of human rights work. She wasn't involved in the union. Lopa was not involved in the union. My colleague who was walking across University Park describing, I didn't know the union could. This is the sort of building commitment to the union that builds power, that shifts the balance of forces, that makes winning possible. And how you do that arc that people like, everyone goes through it in some ways, but it looks different. There's no formula. It's different for different people, and it shouldn't and it won't look the same. But that sort of arc, if that can be replicated, if we can get better at helping people do that, it's the only way we can build the power that shifts things, that makes winning possible. And I think actually, we know we can do it because we see it being done. We need to get better at almost dissecting, well, what was going on? How did it happen? How can we make more of it happen? And so the 2 points I'll finish on is what I've just described at one level sounds sort of, uncontentious, pretty straightforward. Right? We need more activists. But of course, what we know is in reality, it's really, really difficult. How do you create? How do you replicate? And I'm not saying what's been done here is perfect in any way, but there's some really impressive elements of it, but how do you replicate? Because you can't just do that in any simple, straightforward way. It's about changing cultures. And that is, so it's sort of an easy thing to agree to do. It's a really difficult thing to do in reality. And the other bit of it is that the only people who can do it are the people in this room, or the people on the call. People who are already really, really busy. We have to find ways to sort of develop this capacity in others, because otherwise we just all run ourselves into the ground and it's not sustainable. The only way this becomes sustainable is finding ways to build the sort of capacity that we've seen with lots of individuals in this branch. But that needs people to think really hard about how you do it. Because for a lot of people, their experience in our movement makes it one that they don't necessarily want to hang around. People develop like this because it's somewhere they feel comfortable and it helps them achieve the things that they believe in. If the culture that you come up against is one that is always trying to cut you down, you don't stay around. So that went on way longer than I intended to. I've tested people's patience way more than I intended to, but it's not the first time, sadly. And I'll finish now.